Good morning. Hope everybody enjoyed themselves last night. Bowling. So my name is Dr. Dana Hutchinson, and it's really my pleasure to have the opportunity to come here today and talk to you about canine adverse food reactions from the nutritionist perspective. So first, a little bit about myself. So I went to North Carolina State University for veterinary school. Do we have any NC State grads in the room? I know we've got at least one. She's hiding back there. Go Wolfpack. Had a phenomenal experience there. And then I came back to the Northeast United States where I'm from and did a small animal rotating internship at Tufts. And then I stayed on at Tufts and I did a residency in small animal clinical nutrition under Dr. Lisa Freeman. And so I am a board certified small animal nutritionist. Currently, I work for Hill's Pet Nutrition in their Scientific Insights department. And in addition to that, I do still see patients clinically. I see nutrition appointments at Angel Animal Medical Center in Boston, Massachusetts, which is actually one of the largest specialty practices in the world. So hopefully my clinical relevance will also be of use to you here today. So let's get started. So here's a situation I think most of us can relate to. Your technician comes into the back room at your clinic to tell you about your next appointment. It's another one of those dreaded itching dogs. And I think many of us have wanted to hide rather than see that appointment for fear that we wouldn't be able to relieve their itching, other than the dermatologists, of course, in the room. But we all know we can't hide from these dogs because we see them so often clinically. And so when you're seeing these dogs that I know you see all the time, and you've narrowed down your differentials to an allergic cause of their skin disease, think about for a second, what are the 3 most common allergic skin diseases in dogs? So the 3 most common allergic skin diseases in dogs are flea allergy dermatitis, atopic dermatitis, and adverse food reactions. And today I'm just going to focus on adverse food reactions. And remember, adverse food reaction simply means an abnormal response to an ingested food or food additive. So while we often think of these as immune-mediated, they don't have to be. It also includes things like dietary indiscretion, something very common in our patient population, and food poisoning, and metabolic reactions to foods, things like lactose intolerance. And then, of course, we have that classic food allergy we often think of when we think of adverse food reactions. And we usually think of those as IgE-mediated, but the truth of the matter is that in most cases of adverse food reaction, we really don't know the underlying mechanism. So I thought, what better way to highlight some key insights for diagnosing and managing these dogs today than by going through one of my own real-life cases. So let me introduce you to Stella. Isn't she adorable? So when I first saw Stella, she was a 3.5-year-old spayed female English bulldog with a long history of waxing and waning pruritus. Stella's owner came to see me on one cold day in early December in the Northeast United States where we live, because while her regular veterinarian had ruled out sarcoptic mange through a skin scrape, had ruled out fleas and flea allergy, and treated several secondary bacterial infections, Stella's signs just kept coming back. And Stella's owner thought that it was due to several food allergies. And so she actually was very uncomfortable with all of the foods her veterinarian had recommended. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding. I thought so. So they came to see me, and to give you a little bit more background on Stella's clinical picture, when I saw her, she had bilateral otitis, she had severe excoriations around her neck, and she had erythema of her foot pads bilaterally. So based on what I've told you so far, how many people, with a show of hands, think Stella suffers from an adverse food reaction? Getting some in-between hand raises. How many people don't think she suffers from an adverse food reaction? And how many people think we don't have enough information yet? Ah, wonderful. That's right. We don't have enough information to figure that out. So we need to look, of course, in part at her diet history. And I'm going to show you more of Stella's diet history a little bit later, but at this point, I at least wanted to share with you her owner-reported allergies. So I send diet history forms to owners via email prior to their appointments, and I actually will not see the patient unless the diet history form is returned ahead of time. It is so important, so important. And so this is just one page from that diet history, and as you can see here, Stella's owner reported several food allergies. And I know this is very familiar to all of you. Stella's owner believed that she was allergic to all grains and beans, all red meat, turkey and chicken, several vegetables, several oils, and all dairy and soy. So do you think that Stella suffers from this many adverse food reactions? I certainly hope not. Poor Stella, and poor us as the veterinarian, right? Trying to find a food for these dogs. So does she suffer from this many adverse food reactions? Well, if we look at the prevalence of adverse food reactions in dogs, the reality is we really do not have a good understanding as a profession of how common these are. One study found that of dogs with allergic skin disease, about 10 to 20% of those dogs had an adverse food reaction. So it's a fairly small proportion of the population. Now, of those dogs that do have an adverse food reaction, how likely is it that they suffer from an allergy to more than one food? Well, one study found that about 35 to 45 to 45, 48% of those dogs had allergies to more than one food, with an average of 2 foods. So is it likely that Stella suffers from that many adverse food reactions? Probably not. Probably not. Is it likely that all those owners bringing you their dog and giving you long lists of allergies have that many food allergies? No, it is very unlikely. And that's really important for us clinically because we are often seeing these dogs and we're trying to treat other conditions, right? We're trying to treat liver disease, kidney disease, fat intolerance. And so what this means is that in those pets, most of the time, the food appropriate for those other conditions would be perfectly suitable for those pets. So really important information clinically. So while Stella probably doesn't suffer from as many adverse food reactions as her owner believes, we certainly need to rule it out, right? Because we absolutely need to get to the bottom of her pruritus. We know it's impacting the quality of life for Stella and really the whole family. Most of us, if you ask us, we sleep with our pets, and if there's an itching dog in the room, nobody's getting any sleep. So we've got to get to the bottom of it. So how would you rule out an adverse food reaction in this case? So one piece of the puzzle I haven't shared with you yet is that Stella's owner also brought to her appointment the results of a saliva and hair sample test that she found online. She actually got a Groupon for it. And it was a way of diagnosing food allergies, or at least it was marketed as a way of diagnosing food allergies. So she brought this with her to the appointment because she wanted to make sure I could see it, of course. And this is actually one of 3 pages that she received in the mail. So she sent in a sample of Stella's hair and saliva, and in return received 3 pages that looked like this. There were foods that were supposedly good for her on every page, foods that were neutral, so presumably foods she should probably avoid, and then foods that were bad for her. So we can assume those are foods they were suggesting she was allergic to. Stella's owner was absolutely frozen in fear. And she's not alone. A lot of our owners are finding tests like this. How stressful for an owner. Stella's owner was actually going to pet food store after pet food store with her list, comparing it to the ingredients on the back of the pet food bags, trying to find even just one food that she thought was safe for her dog. How stressful. So is this how we diagnose an adverse food reaction? A little bit louder. No. So how do we diagnose an adverse food reaction then? We've got a lot of tests available. We've got IgE and IgG serology. We've got intradermal and epicutaneous patch testing, lymphocyte stimulation testing. Or do we use none of these? None. The answers are getting louder and more confident. I like that. None of these tests. Now, certainly there's a lot left to be known about lymphocyte stimulation testing, but most of these other tests, well, they have fairly good negative predictive value, meaning if a food shows up negative for a particular dog, it's true that it's unlikely the pet would have a reaction to that food, but the opposite is not true. Most of these tests have extremely poor positive predictive value, meaning if a food shows up positive, does not mean that we can assume that the pet is actually allergic to that food. And so inherently, it makes these tests poor diagnostic tools for ruling out an adverse food reaction. So how do we diagnose an adverse food reaction? An elimination diet trial, right? Of course, that is the only definitive test we have at this point in time to diagnose adverse food reactions. So do you think Stella warrants an elimination diet trial? Does she fit that classic clinical picture of a dog with an adverse food reaction? Well, what does that classic dog look like? Well, certainly there are always going to be exceptions, but most of these dogs, they develop clinical signs at less than 3 years of age. Many of them actually under a year of age, up to a third. The number one clinical sign of an adverse food reaction, non-seasonal pruritus. Stella suffers from that. Many of these dogs also have bilateral otitis. Unfortunately, poor Stella was dealing with that. And a fair proportion of these dogs have concurrent gastrointestinal signs. And so I'll tell you, while I really do believe that food allergies are grossly overdiagnosed, they are not particularly common, if I see a young dog with a relatively long history of concurrent gastrointestinal and dermatologic signs, adverse food reaction is much higher on my differentials list. So in those dogs where we believe they really do suffer from an adverse food reaction, what are the most common foods causing these reactions? Well, in dogs, we believe that the majority of these reactions are due to beef, dairy, chicken, and wheat. And in cats, the three most common foods are beef, dairy, and fish. So does that mean that we should avoid these ingredients in healthy pets? Absolutely not. This is not a common disease, and so we really do not need to avoid these ingredients in healthy pets. But back to Stella. So do you think Stella warrants an elimination diet trial based on everything I've told you? Yeah, I thought so too. So then what's the next step? Picking one, absolutely. So how are we going to pick one? We've got to, again, look to that diet history, right? We need to figure out what would actually be novel for Stella. And so if I wanted to say that if you're not using a diet history form, not just for your derm patients, but for all of your patients, I would urge you to try it. It can really be very, very helpful. And if you're not using a diet history, there's actually a wonderful resource available to you on the World Small Animal Veterinary Association website under their nutrition toolkit. A number of great resources there, including a diet history form that you can download. It's short, simple, easy to use, and available to you. So a great starting point if you aren't using a diet history. So what aspects of Stella's diet history do we need to ask the owner about? Well, the short answer is everything. We've really got to investigate because we need to identify everything that Stella has ever eaten in order to figure out what would truly be novel for her, right? So we need to ask about not just previous pet foods, but other pets' foods, grandparents, toddlers, doggy daycare, dog walkers, trainers, neighbors, mailmen. We need to ask about flavored medications, foods used to give medications, flavored heartworm preventatives. We need to ask about everything Stella could have possibly eaten so that we can then truly identify what would be novel for her. And then once we've done that, we have two main options, right? We have hydrolyzed therapeutic foods, and we have novel therapeutic foods and novel homemade diets, which should always be formulated by board-certified nutritionists. So at this point in the conversation with clients, I find it's really helpful to go through the values of those foods so that they understand why we're recommending the food we're recommending. So in the case of hydrolyzed foods, I don't think that we really need to get into all the details of how a hydrolyzed food works with every client. So we don't necessarily need to describe cross-linking of IgE on the surface of mast cells and degranulation. But I do think if we're going to recommend a hydrolyzed food, we need to, at least in very general terms, explain how these foods work. So I simply say, the protein source has been broken down to be so small it makes it unlikely that your pet would elicit an immune reaction even if they've had that food before. And while that's a simple explanation, it's so important. Because if we go through a long discussion in the exam room about avoiding proteins their pet has had before, and then we send home a hydrolyzed food but don't explain how that works, well, when the owner gets home and looks at that ingredient list, which we know our owners do, and they see there's a protein source that their pet has had before, they're going to think that we recommended a food that wasn't appropriate for their pet. And they probably won't feed that food, and they may even start to question their trust in us. And I share that because I've seen these clients. I have had clients come to me for a second opinion because they thought that their vet had recommended an inappropriate food because they simply didn't know how a hydrolyzed food worked. So really important. And in the case of hydrolyzed foods, I also like to point out to owners that it's not just the protein source. These foods are really designed for pets with dermatologic and gastrointestinal issues. And ZD is a perfect example. And they've recently added cellulose. And that really makes a difference for a lot of these dogs that have the concurrent gastrointestinal signs. And in the case of novel therapeutic foods, I like to point out to owners that they go through extremely rigorous quality control measures to ensure there is a single pure protein source in these foods, making them really appropriate for a pet with an adverse food reaction. And in the case of all of the therapeutic foods I recommend, I think it's very important that we explain to owners that these are really high quality foods. They are not choosing between a high-quality pet food and a food appropriate for their pet's disease. They are getting both. And that's not just my personal opinion. If we use the objective criteria for evaluating pet food quality as recommended by the World Small Animal Veterinary Association in their nutritional assessment guidelines, so strict internal quality control, their own manufacturing facilities, board-certified nutritionists, AFCO feeding trials, these foods meet those criteria. And the overwhelming majority of over-the-counter foods, no matter how much money they're spending, are not going to. So this is really helpful for owners. It's reassuring to them to know that they are not choosing high quality versus a food for their pet's disease. They can feel confident and comfortable feeding their food. So I went through all of this with Stella's owner, and she looked at me and got a puzzled look on her face, and she said, "But Dr. Hutchinson, I know you looked at my diet history. And I told you I have already diagnosed her food allergies. I know what Stella's allergic to." I'm hearing some people that sound like they've had this experience before. So let's take a look at Stella's history in a little bit more detail. So this is an abridged version of Stella's diet history. I couldn't fit anything else up there. So on the left-hand side of every slide, we have her previous foods, an abridged version. So we have the foods her owner fed, how long she fed them, and then why she stopped. And on the right-hand side of every slide, you'll see her current diet. So yes, Stella was receiving all of those foods currently when I saw her. Does anyone have any concerns with Stella's owner diagnosing adverse food reactions based on what you're seeing here? Okay. Not hearing any specifics, but I'm hearing some laughs. So this is not ideal for diagnosing an adverse food reaction. So I have a few concerns. One concern, I'm a little bit wary of the length of some of the trials. It's a little hard to tell, but it doesn't look like they were necessarily as long as maybe they should have been. Looking at her current diet, I'm a little bit concerned that she's not doing an exclusive elimination diet trial. While ZD was a perfectly reasonable option for Stella for an elimination diet trial, she's feeding over-the-counter treats, and she's also feeding an over-the-counter pet food and some human foods that Stella's eaten before. And so certainly this is not an exclusive elimination diet trial. And then most importantly, I have significant concerns with diagnosing adverse food reactions based on feeding over-the-counter limited ingredient foods. And this is very important. We cannot use these foods to diagnose adverse food reactions. They are simply not designed to be used for this purpose. A number of studies have found that when they look at these foods and they use ELISAs, they find that many of these foods are contaminated with protein sources not listed on their ingredient list. One study, for example, looked at over-the-counter limited ingredient venison dog foods, and they found that 3/4 of them were contaminated with soy, not listed on the ingredient list, and 1/4 of those foods were contaminated with beef, not listed on the ingredient list. So if we use a food like that for an elimination diet trial and the pet doesn't respond, we don't know, did they not have an adverse food reaction? Or were they allergic to one of the ingredients in that food that was not listed on that ingredient list? So really not appropriate for diagnosing adverse food reactions. So I went through all of that with Stella's owner, and as with most owners, it made total sense to her. She just needed someone to explain it. And she said, okay, I get it. Let's do this right once and for all and get to the bottom of this. And so what would you recommend for Stella? Would you want to feed her a homemade diet of simply 2 ingredients, just rice and lamb? Would you want to feed her a therapeutic hydrolyzed food? Or would you want to feed her a limited ingredient venison food, therapeutic food? So this is a polling question. I'm so anxious to see the results. All right. I like what I'm seeing here. All right. Well, it looks like therapeutic hydrolyzed food wins. So does anyone have any concerns with option number 1? Hearing lots of great answers. I heard unbalanced. I heard she's had lamb before. Those are both correct. So when it comes to, historically, I know it's been very common to recommend that an owner feed just 1 protein and 1 carbohydrate source for just a few weeks, 3 weeks or so, with the best intentions that it will be a short-term therapeutic option. The problem I have with that is that if a patient has significant enough dermatologic disease that I think they warrant an elimination diet trial, I don't want to restrict their access to nutrients critical for skin health, even for a few weeks. And even more important than that, we know that when our owners see a difference from what they're doing, they do not want to stop. So even if we tell them to just feed that food for a few weeks, if their pet's skin is getting better, they may continue that for a very long time. And that certainly isn't going to be balanced for long-term feeding. And as someone else mentioned, Stella, if you have a great memory and remember some of those foods that were on her history, Stella has actually had lamb before, and so it's also not going to be novel for her. Therapeutic hydrolyzed food, any concerns with that? Okay, I don't hear any concerns with that one. And what about a limited ingredient venison food? She's had venison before, exactly. And so remember, there's nothing particularly hypoallergenic about exotic protein sources. We simply need to find a protein source that pet hasn't had before. And so that would be a great option for a lot of dogs, but not in Stella's case because she's had venison. And so we actually did send Stella home on ZD dry. And so do we just send them out the door? hand them the bag and then send them out the door? I certainly hope not. That makes my heart hurt. We have got to set these clients up for success. We have got to explain to them how an elimination diet trial works and what they can and cannot feed their pet. So that means, once again, going through everything. Dog walkers, doggy daycare, trainers, family members in the house, other pets' food, flavored medications, flavored heartworm preventative, flavored toothpaste, flavored joint chews. Things owners think of as toys but are actually treats like rawhides, nylabones. We've got to talk about all of these things to make sure that the owner will have a successful elimination diet trial that we can then therefore use when we're trying to rule out an adverse food reaction. And in the case of those owners that are giving a lot of treats, we've got to give them alternatives because we want to make sure that they're able to comply. And we know owners show love through food. Food is love. So if an owner's used to giving a lot of treats, recommending something like a therapeutic hypoallergenic treat, like prescription diet hypoallergenic treats, recommending the dry form of the therapeutic food you've recommended, feeding that from like a treat jar or a bag is another great option. But we've got to give them some alternatives so that we can help make compliance easy for them. So I went through all of that with Stella. And so how long would you send her home on this trial for? When would you want to see her back? How long should an elimination diet trial be conducted? This is a polling question. All right. You guys are good. Really good. So a recent study found that 90% of dogs with cutaneous adverse food reactions could be diagnosed after just an 8-week trial. So that's really great news for us after just 8 weeks. Now, certainly there are going to be cases where you might want to extend that trial for various reasons, but a lot of dogs will have an answer in just 8 weeks. So that's great news. And so that's what I did in Stella's case. So her owner fed ZD for all of December, all of January, and came back to see me in early February. And Stella's skin looked terrible. Terrible. So at this point, can we rule out an adverse food reaction? And should we move on to our other differentials? I heard a very strong no, and I like it. So we can't. We have got to revisit that diet history and make sure the owner actually did an elimination diet trial, because we know these trials are very challenging for our owners, and we know that our owners struggle with compliance. So that's what I did in Stella's case. We talked a little bit about her history, and her owner said, Dr. Hutchinson, you'd be so proud of us. The kids are on board. The dog walker's on board. We're feeding the cat on the counter so that Stella can't get her food. But there's always that but. But Stella does spend a lot of time outside, and the mailman does manage to throw her a treat as he drives by before we can stop him. She gets one about every other day. So what does this mean? Well, it means we really haven't done an exclusive elimination diet trial, that's for sure. And what it means is that we had to start all over again. And so that's what we did. We formulated a plan to address the mailman. We actually made a card that was bright yellow and stuck it on the front of the mailbox. It said, "No treats for Stella," with an exclamation point. Kind of sad, but for Stella's own good, and it worked. So Stella's owner went home, put that sign on the mailbox, and they did an exclusive elimination diet trial for another 8 weeks, for all of February and all of March. And they came back to see me in early April, which is just the beginning of spring in the Northeast United States where we live. Stella's skin looked great. It was about 75 to 80% improved. Really huge improvement. But I'll tell you, I did not re-challenge her with her old food at this point. Can anyone think of why I may not have done that? I actually continued the trial for another 8 weeks, for all of April and all of May, and I saw them again in early June. Can anyone think of why I may have done that? I like what I'm hearing. Other potential allergens, exactly. So if I re-challenge Stella with her old food at the same time that environmental allergens are becoming prevalent in her environment, and we see recurrence of her skin disease, we wouldn't know, does she have an environmental allergen, or was it due to an adverse food reaction? It's really, really important. And I actually plan my diet trials to avoid times of the year like this, finishing at times like this. But if you'll remember, in Stella's case, we had a bit of a compliance issue, so we were set back 8 weeks. So really, really important. So I wanted to continue the ZD well into that time of the year where if she had an environmental allergy, we may see a flare so that we would know if there was recurrence of her signs, it was not due to a re-challenge with her old food. So that's what we did. They came back 8 weeks later in early June. I remember it was a beautiful, warm day. Flowers were in bloom. All my recheck appointments were doing phenomenal. And then Stella showed up. And she looked terrible. Her owner was frustrated. I was frustrated. And I'm sure Stella was frustrated. She was so pruritic. It was one of those appointments where the dog was itching so much in the room, it was hard to concentrate and hold a conversation with the owner. It was awful. So what do you think's going on with Stella? What do you think's going on? So another polling question. Do you think she has atopic dermatitis? Or do you think she has an adverse food reaction? Or do you think she has both? Oh. All right. You guys continue to impress me. So poor Stella was actually one of these very unlucky dogs that suffered from both adverse food reaction and atopic dermatitis. If you'll remember, when I first saw her, it was early December. That's a time in the year when owners are taking out their holiday decorations covered in dust. With that comes dust mites. Her skin got a little bit better, but then flared again in the spring and May and June when environmental allergens are becoming prevalent, including pollen. And actually, dust mites and pollen are two of the most common environmental allergens in dogs. And unfortunately, atopic dogs are at an increased risk of developing adverse food reactions. And so Stella was one of these unlucky dogs. Her atopy was diagnosed through a diagnosis of exclusion with a lot of help from her dermatologist. Her adverse food reaction was confirmed through waiting till times in the year when her skin was significantly better, then re-challenging her with her old food, seeing recurrence of her clinical signs, then putting her back on the ZD and seeing improvements. And we actually did that twice just to confirm because she was a bit of a complicated case. And so what are we going to do for Stella? Well, I knew that I could address her adverse food reaction through nutrition, of course, through an appropriate protein source, an appropriate therapeutic food. But I also wanted to do what I could for Stella to manage her atopy through nutrition as part of multimodal therapy for atopy. So what nutrients of concern would you have for atopy? What aspects of that disease do you think we can impact through nutrition? So I'm sure you have 1,000 answers going through your head because Dr. McClay just gave you a phenomenal presentation. So I think of 3 main categories I can address or try to address through nutrition. I can try to address skin barrier dysfunction, so addressing skin barrier function through nutrition. I can address inflammation at the level of the skin through nutrition, and I can address oxidative stress. So first, thinking about addressing skin barrier function. So what nutrients of concern would you have trying to address skin barrier function when you're choosing a food for Stella? I'm hearing a lot of different answers, and I'll bet that they're probably all correct because so many nutrients play a critical role in skin health. Few that I think of, omega-6 fatty acids are absolutely critical to that transepidermal water layer. I also think of nutrients like B vitamin and zinc because they play a role in the synthesis of those lipids in the skin. What about managing the inflammation in her skin? What nutrients of concern would you have? What nutrients are you going to look for when choosing a food? Omega-3 fatty acids? Yeah, and I put a picture of salmon up there because I know you were all out having fun last night. I wanted to give you a little hint there. So omega-3 fatty acids is, I think, probably what most people were thinking about, and that's absolutely true. There's quite a bit of research that shows that through supplementation with omega-3s, we can really impact their skin health. And when I talk about omega-3s, I always get the same question. What dose do I use for any number of diseases? And the short answer to that is that in our profession, for most diseases, we don't know the optimal dose of omega-3s. But in skin disease, based on what research is available, I recommend a total omega-3 fatty acid dose of 125 milligrams per kilogram of metabolic body weight, and an icosapentaenoic acid dose of 180 milligrams per 10 pounds of body weight. And then what about that ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids? We've got to think about that too, because while we think of omega-6s as pro-inflammatory, we know they're essential for skin health, for immune health. And based on what research is available, it looks like a lower ratio is important for skin health, so closer to a 2-to-1 ratio. So we're going to look for that as well. And then lastly, how are we going to manage oxidative stress? Antioxidants, right, antioxidants. And ideally we're going to see multiple antioxidants in the food since we know that many antioxidants are able to work synergistically. And I hope that we're going to see vitamin E in there because vitamin E is that major fat-soluble antioxidant, so it's going to play a critical role at the level of the skin. Okay, so we have our nutrients of concern for Stella's atopy. Now let's choose a food for her. So I've listed at the top of the screen a number of foods marketed for skin health. And let's go through those nutrients of concern and see if we can narrow down what food might be best for Stella. So first and foremost, we've got to think about that protein source because certainly a food is not going to be an option if the protein source isn't appropriate for Stella since she suffers from an adverse food reaction. So that helps us narrow it down a little bit. And what I didn't mention earlier is that Stella actually hasn't ever had fish before. Her owner heard at the dog park when Stella was a puppy that fish was bad for dogs, which it is not. But that worked in our favor because it meant that fish was actually novel for her. So we have a number of options still. Then if we look at the vitamin E and omega-6 fatty acid amounts in the food, a few foods were a little higher than others, and that helps us narrow it down a little bit more. And then if we look at the total omega-3 fatty acid amount and the EPA amount, now if we use the doses that I mentioned earlier, based on Stella's body weight, that would be at least 700 milligrams of total omega-3s and at least 400 milligrams of EPA. And I also calculated for you how much of each of those nutrients Stella would get from her diet if she was eating 1.4 times her resting energy requirement. So you're welcome. I did the math for you. I know everybody loves nutrition math. So that narrows it down a little more. And then lastly, looking at that omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio, and we want about a 2-to-1 ratio, and that again helps us narrow it down a little bit more. And so based on that, what food would you choose for Stella? Any brave souls in the audience want to? I hear DD salmon. So the DD salmon looks like the best option for her. And I'm glad you think so, because that's actually what I chose. That's what Stella went home on. And here is a picture of Stella the last time I saw her. Doesn't she look great? Her owner was happy. Stella was happy. And of course, that made me happy as her veterinarian. And so I hope that Stella's story provides you with some insights and key tips that will help diagnosing and managing your next dreaded itching dog a little bit easier, because we know that it's so important for getting to the bottom of their pruritus so that we can improve the quality of life for these owners and, most importantly, their pets. And so with that, I'll take your questions.
Isn't she an amazing speaker? Thank you so much, Dana. Wonderful.
My pleasure.
All right, we have lots of questions. We also have a panel, so we have about 5 minutes for questions, and then the rest of the questions will be in the panel. The other thing that will happen is people will hand out some questionnaires that you have to fill in for your race accreditation, so please do. There's 2 forms that you need to fill out, and then we will have your race accreditation certificates when you come out. So for everybody that would like to have race accreditation, please take that certificate with you and sign or fill out the forms. They're essential. First question, where are we?
Hi.
What role do you feel you pay attention to when it comes to ancillary protein attachments? So if you're looking at a diet that's a hydrolyzed protein, and you've got chicken oil as the base, and you're still having reactions, and I've had patients where I've gone down this road and I'm still seeing reactions, and there's no way for me to know if it's ancillary protein attachment, because the only thing I can look at is, say, in children that are allergic to peanuts, they're still highly allergic to a purified peanut oil because of ancillary protein attachment.
Yep, that's a great question. So the question was, if I hopefully can summarize it appropriately, how much do we have to worry about additional, something like a chicken oil or another oil that might provide a protein source in a hydrolyzed food if we have a dog that's having a reaction continuously even though they're on a hydrolyzed food? And that's a really controversial topic, but I can tell you my own personal opinion. So what I find is that if a dog truly does have an adverse food reaction, so sometimes simply it's that they don't have an allergy, and maybe the first trial made us really think they did, but it's actually atopy. It's actually an environmental allergen. But in the dogs where we know they have an adverse food reaction and they're continuing to have reactions despite being on a hydrolyzed diet, occasionally there's a very small subset of dogs that will react, and I really do believe, based on my experiences, that is a very, very small proportion of pets. But occasionally we'll have a pet, and sometimes we just need to try a different food, and sometimes we don't know the underlying, was it a preservative, which is extremely uncommon but sometimes happens, or was it something like the oil? So in those cases, I would just try another therapeutic food. I don't think it's a common problem, but occasionally, we all see those pets that just don't respond the way we think that they should. That's a great question.
So just to explain the forms one more time, on the back side you have to fill out front side your name, on the back side it's the evaluations. And for everybody that's in the US streaming right now, we can also get race accreditation on the stream. So you do that through Vetfolio. So if you want to get race accreditation, please follow the Vetfolio instructions to get those race points. All right, any other question?
I think you had a question.
Can you talk about gluten allergy and gluten sensitivity? Because I have countless owners come in on gluten-free diets, and I would love a really powerful response for them.
Well, so do we have to worry about gluten? I think a lot of owners are talking about gluten, and they're saying that they're concerned about gluten in their pet's food because we know it's a huge issue on the human side. But the reality is that for the overwhelming majority of dogs and cats, gluten is not an issue. There is a rare subset of Irish setters that have a gluten-related enteropathy, but it is extremely rare. I literally have never seen a case of it. I read about it in textbooks and in articles, but the majority of pets do not have an issue with gluten. And so while many areas of human medicine can translate to our pets, that thankfully doesn't seem to be an issue for dogs. And that's usually how I try to frame it with clients, is that I have really great news. Gluten is not an issue like it is in a lot of people. And sometimes that works, and sometimes, as we all know, sometimes owners just want to feed what they want to feed.
Okay, one more question, and then we'll still have the panel. So yes, go ahead.
I just had a question about flea prevention. When you're doing a diet trial, are you recommending using the oral flea products and also the Heartgard?
I do. I actually really like the oral flea products, and I find they're.
The question?
So the question was, what do I recommend for flea prevention when you're dealing with a pet that has a presumed adverse food reaction, or you're doing a diet trial, and we have some really great options now in veterinary medicine with the oral flea preventatives, and so I try to go with an oral flea preventative. I try to, yeah.
So the second question, heartworm too?
Yes, and with heartworm too, if we can go with an oral option, it's preferable.
Great, thank you so much. You will be back on stage pretty soon.
Thank you.